Imagine walking down a city street in the early 1920s, and from an open window above you drifts the sound of a piano, something you've never quite heard before. It's jazz, but it's more than jazz. It's a whole new world announcing itself. That sound was coming from Harlem, New York City, and what was happening there wasn't just music. It was a revolution, one fought not with weapons, but with poetry, with paintbrushes, with novels, and with an unshakable belief that black life in America was beautiful, complex, and worthy of celebration. This was the Harlem Renaissance, and it changed America forever. To really understand what the Harlem Renaissance was, you have to understand what came before it. For decades following the end of the Civil War and the collapse of Reconstruction, black Americans in the South lived under the brutal weight of Jim Crow laws. Segregation was the law of the land. Lynchings were horrifyingly common. Economic opportunity was deliberately strangled. And so, beginning around 1910 and accelerating through World War I, something remarkable happened. Hundreds of thousands of black Americans packed up everything they owned and headed north. Historians call it the Great Migration, and it was one of the largest movements of people in American history. They came to cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and above all, New York. And in New York, they came to Harlem. Now, Harlem hadn't always been a black neighborhood. In the early 1900s, it had actually been a wealthy white district that hit a real estate slump. A black realtor named Philip Payton Jr. seized the opportunity, convincing landlords to rent to black tenants rather than let their buildings sit empty. It worked. And slowly, block by block, Harlem transformed. By the 1920s, it had become the cultural capital of black America, a place where someone arriving from Georgia or Mississippi could breathe a little easier, dream a little bigger, and find a community that understood exactly who they were. Into this neighborhood poured an extraordinary generation of artists, thinkers, and dreamers. There was Langston Hughes, a young man from Missouri who arrived in Harlem in the early 20s and proceeded to write some of the most powerful poetry in the English language. His work didn't try to sound like the white literary establishment. It sounded like the streets of Harlem, like blues music, like the rhythms of everyday black speech. When he wrote about dreams deferred, asking what happens to a dream that dries up like a raisin in the sun, he was speaking to an entire people's experience of being told to wait, to be patient, to be grateful for whatever scraps were offered. His words cut right to the bone, and they still do. Then there was Zora Neale Hurston, a writer and anthropologist from Florida who was so alive on the page that you can practically hear her laughing as you read. Her masterpiece, Their Eyes Were Watching God, was the story of a black woman searching for herself on her own terms, not through the lens of white approval, not through the expectations of the men around her, but purely, fiercely, on her own. Hurston was controversial in her time, beloved in ours, and she stands as one of the greatest writers America has ever produced. Alongside the writers were the visual artists. Aaron Douglas became the defining painter of the Harlem Renaissance, developing a striking visual style that drew on African art forms and used bold silhouettes and geometric shapes to tell the story of the black experience in America. His murals celebrated African heritage at a time when American culture either ignored or caricatured it. He painted figures with dignity and power, looking forward and upward, refusing to be reduced. And then there was the music. If the Harlem Renaissance had a heartbeat, it was jazz and blues. Duke Ellington, who would become one of the most important composers in American history, was holding court at the Cotton Club by the late 1920s, his orchestra creating sounds that were simultaneously sophisticated and deeply rooted in the black American musical tradition. Louis Armstrong was dazzling audiences with a trumpet virtuosity nobody had ever seen before. Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues, was recording songs that could make you weep and laugh in the same breath. Now here's something worth pausing on, because the Cotton Club is a complicated piece of this story. It was one of the most famous venues of the era, it showcased some of the greatest black talent in the country, and yet for most of its history, it refused to admit black patrons. Harlem's own musicians were performing for all white audiences, and the neighborhood's own residents often couldn't get through the door. This contradiction, black artistry celebrated and exploited simultaneously, ran straight through the heart of the Harlem Renaissance. White America was fascinated by black culture in a way it had never quite been before, buying the records, packing the clubs, reading the novels. But full equality remained as distant as ever. That tension was something the intellectuals of the movement grappled with constantly. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the towering figures of the era, had been writing about the concept of double consciousness for years, this sense that black Americans were always looking at themselves through the eyes of a society that didn't fully accept them, forced to maintain two identities at once. Du Bois edited a magazine called The Crisis, which became one of the most important publications of the era, publishing the work of writers and artists while also documenting the ongoing fight for civil rights. Philip Randolph was organizing black workers. Marcus Garvey was building a Pan-Africanist movement that called for black pride and solidarity on a global scale. Alain Locke, a philosophy professor who became one of the movement's most important champions, edited an anthology called The New Negro in 1925 that essentially announced to the world that something transformative was happening. The old stereotypes, the old limitations, the old apologetic posture, all of it was being left behind. A new generation was here, and they were not asking for permission to exist. The word New Negro became a kind of rallying cry, not referring to any single political position, but to a collective spirit of self-determination, creativity, and pride. The Harlem Renaissance didn't end neatly. Like most cultural movements, it faded gradually rather than stopping all at once. The Great Depression hit black communities with particular ferocity. Funding dried up. Publishers pulled back. The party slowed down. By the mid-1930s, the white fascination with Harlem had cooled, and the neighborhood itself was being pushed deeper into poverty. Many of the artists scattered, struggled, some fell into obscurity for decades before being rediscovered. But here's what didn't die. The ideas didn't die. The art didn't die. The music didn't die. The Harlem Renaissance laid the cultural and intellectual groundwork for everything that came after: the civil rights movement, the black arts movement, the ongoing conversation about identity and justice and beauty in America that we're still having today. When you read Toni Morrison or listen to Miles Davis or look at the work of contemporary black visual artists, you are looking at children of the Harlem Renaissance, inheritors of something planted in those Harlem apartments and jazz clubs and literary salons 100 years ago. Langston Hughes, in one of his poems, asked a question that still hangs in the American air. He asked what America would be like without its black citizens, without their labor, their sacrifice, their culture, their creativity, and then answered his own question by saying simply, "America never was America to me. But I swear this oath, America will be." That combination of clear-eyed pain and unbreakable hope is the spirit of the Harlem Renaissance. A community that had every reason to be silenced, choosing instead to sing louder than anyone had ever sung before. That's the vintage America we're here to remember. Thank you for watching.